Bonjour, merci à tous et à toutes de nous rejoindre pour cette dernière session de Médias en scène. Merci aux organisateurs d'avoir mis à l'honneur le travail des médias et leur engagement toute cette journée. C'est quelque chose aussi qui nous tient beaucoup à cœur chez Sparknews, puisque nous travaillons depuis des années avec les grands médias à travers le monde, les entrepreneurs sociaux et les leaders d'opinion pour acculturer le plus grand nombre aux enjeux de la transition écologique et sociale. C'est donc un grand honneur pour moi de vous présenter aujourd'hui Bill Mckibben, qui, bien qu'il soit plus connu du grand public français, est un journaliste, auteur et militant américain de premier plan dans le domaine du climat. Donc, au cours des 30 dernières années, il a fusionné ses capacités de narration de journaliste et d'auteur avec des méthodes pionnières de protestation sociale, et il a réussi à allier des stratégies traditionnelles propres aux organisations avec la puissance des médias sociaux. Mais avant d'entrer dans le vif du sujet, aussi quelques dates pour vous situer ce qu'a fait Bill Mckibben, à commencer par 1988, qui est la date à laquelle il a publié son ouvrage The End of Nature, qui a été publié en 24 langues et qui a été traduit en français par le titre Nature assassinée, et qui alertait déjà à l'époque sur le changement climatique. Puis en 2009, il a fondé l'association 350.org, qui est une ONG qui a rapidement devenu un instrument de mobilisation internationale sur le climat et le fer de lance de la lutte contre les énergies fossiles. Parallèlement à cela, il a donc continué son travail de journaliste et d'auteur prolifique en écrivant pour des grands titres américains. Et il a publié en 2019 son dernier ouvrage qui s'intitule « Falter, Has the Human Game Begun to Play Itself Out ?» qui est sorti en juin dernier en France sous le titre « Humanicide, la fin d'un règne ». Donc voilà pour planter le décor. Bill est présent avec nous en direct depuis les États-Unis et il va donc nous parler de ce sujet très intéressant qu'est le lien entre les médias et le changement climatique. Et pour ce faire, nous allons basculer in English. Hi Bill, thank you for coming here today, for joining us.
Well, a great pleasure, and I apologize for my lack of French.
No worries. We'll just go through it in English, no problem at all. So it's been more than 30 years since you've published your book, The End of Nature, which was a warning about what we're currently living right now. And since then, you've not only been a chronicler of climate change, but also a major figure, a major player in the fight to change environmental policies and the narrative around these complex subjects. So I guess my first question is, when exactly and why did you decide to cross the line between journalism and activism? In the sense that, are you now in a much better place to inform and influence now?
Well, it's a very good question, because I was very much a just straight ahead journalist as a very young man. But I wrote this book, The End of Nature, when I was 27, the first book about climate change for a general audience. And I wrote it, I think I started writing it because I thought this was a great story, a great scoop. Halfway through the book, it was very clear to me that I cared a lot about the outcome. I wasn't totally objective. I didn't want the world to heat up and burn up, and that seemed a tragedy to me. So from that point on, I've been a different kind of journalist. I couldn't be the kind of cover climate change for the New York Times as a kind of beat reporter, but I've been able to do a lot of journalism just acknowledging the fact that I care about the outcome. At a certain point, about 10 years into this, it became clear to me that I was also probably going to have to be an activist too. My initial assumption had been that we were in an argument, and that you win arguments by writing more books, having more conferences, delivering more speeches, and eventually the weight of evidence piles up so high that our leaders have to act. But at a certain point, maybe 20 years ago, it became clear to me that we'd won the argument. The science was very clear. We were just losing the fight, because the fight wasn't really about fact and data and reason and evidence. The fight was what fights are usually about: money and power. And the other side of this fight, the fossil fuel industry, had so much money and hence so much power that they were able to keep doing what they were doing, even though they'd lost the argument. So that's when I began trying to organize movements with many other people to build the kind of power we would need to be able to take them on.
So in a way, you're saying that it's kind of fighting power with power.
Yeah, I mean, if you're an oil company, if you're Exxon or Total or something, your power comes from money. You have an almost unlimited amount. Obviously, the environmental movement's never going to have money like that. But what it can substitute is bodies, is creativity, is passion, is spirit. I mean, sometimes we need to literally kind of be willing to spend our bodies and go to jail. And so that's how movements build, and that's what the last 10 years has been about. 350.org, which I helped start, was a kind of early iteration, a beta test really of movement building. It got big fast around the world, and now happily so many others have joined in. Extinction Rebellion, the Sunrise Movement with the Green New Deal, Fridays for the Future, and the Youth Climate Strikers. It's been remarkable to watch.
And speaking about these movements, these new generation movement, which is quite interesting because the age you actually published your book is the average age of people in these associations, if not younger. How do you think, what are your views on how they are actively changing the narrative?
I think what they're changing, I think that the key work of movements at this point, it has something to do with passing laws and so on, but their biggest effect comes in changing the zeitgeist. It's a German word, but in use here, and I assume in France as well. Changing the mood, changing the sense of what's normal or natural or obvious. And that's really what people who build big movements about huge, crucial issues like this, I think, are playing for. What they're trying to do is change the mood. And I think each one of these groups has done an enormous amount to make it happen. Extinction Rebellion brings a kind of street sense to this. The Sunrise Movement started in America, young people, brings us really powerful policy planning and advocacy, the Green New Deal. Fridays for the Future and the climate strikes just brings extraordinary passion and energy. Everybody knows about Greta Thunberg, and everybody should. Greta is remarkable. She's one of my favorite people to work with. There's no one I admire more. But the really good news is there are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs scattered around the planet, and they have 10 million followers behind them. And they really are changing our sense of what's inevitable. And that's a key part of this fight. It makes all the political work that much easier. One of the places where everybody's leaning hard now is not just on political fights, but on economic ones. My friend and colleague Naomi Klein and I started this divestment movement around fossil fuel 8 or 9 years ago, and it's now grown into the largest anti-corporate campaign in history. We're at about $15 trillion worth of endowments and portfolios that have divested in part or in whole from fossil fuel. I mean, just this year, we've watched Oxford University and Cambridge University divest. We've watched the Queen of England begin to divest her holdings. We've seen the Pope call out for massive divestment. So it's really important. We've got to cut off the funding for this enterprise because left to itself, it's like a headless chicken that just keeps on moving. One of the worst examples of this is what's going on in France with the continued effort to build this oil pipeline through East Africa that Total and others are involved in. It's outrageous. It's an ancient idea. It should have been, killed off 10, 20, 30 years ago. It makes no sense in a world that's heating as rapidly as ours to be looking for new sources of oil, not when sun and wind are now the cheapest ways to generate power around the earth. But until people really get in the way, until they stand up, these kind of just mindless projects go on and on and on because somebody thinks they can make a buck doing it.
Okay, and so you're saying that in a way these movements, they've managed to burst out of the ecologist echo chamber. They're managing to reach out and actually make a change in the world and change the way funding is attributed and such.
Well, Shell Oil last year said in their annual report that divestment had become a material risk to their business. That's a very good sign because Shell Oil's business is a material risk to all of us. You know, in the US, our most well-known television investment advisor, stock picker, a man named Jim Cramer, devoted 2 nights of his show this year, this January, to telling people to stop investing in oil companies because the divestment movement had become so large that it was just making it impossible to make money from them. And you can see all this starting to happen. You know, Exxon for many years was the largest company on earth, and then when it was surpassed by Apple and Amazon, it was still by far the largest energy company on earth. But about 2 weeks ago, a Florida-based renewable energy company, sun and wind company called Next Era Energy, passed Exxon in terms of market capitalization to become the biggest energy company on the planet. This is a kind of sign of the kind of work that people are doing. And now we're pushing into the banks and the asset managers and the insurance companies that fund the oil companies. So people have mounted big campaigns against Barclays Bank, against JP Morgan Chase, against Citibank, against all the Bank of America, all the huge financial institutions that are providing a kind of credit card to the oil industry. That's, you know, that's not okay. And those, you know, I mean, I began 2020 by going to jail in Washington after being arrested in the lobby of the Chase Bank branch nearest our nation's capital at the launch of a campaign to get these guys to stop lending money to the fossil fuel industry. A few weeks ago, Chase Bank, largest bank in the world, announced that henceforth its lending would be Paris compliant. It doesn't necessarily mean all that much. We'll find out precisely what it means in practice. But it's a good sign that this sort of pressure is beginning to pay off, and we need much more of it.
Okay, that's a good sign. And now just to jump back to journalism. In newsrooms worldwide, there's a debate about the best way to inform on how to mobilize people on climate change. Some think it's counterproductive to be alarmist, that it might actually make people feel powerless or unable to act. What do you think, how is the best way to tell a story that's engaging and that would motivate people?
Well, I think at this point, I'm sorry to say that it's getting, you know, it's not hard anymore. All you have to do is just, you know, look out the window. I mean, for instance, today, as we sit and talk, the second huge hurricane in 10 days has crossed Central America, just wreaking unbelievable destruction in Honduras and Guatemala and Nicaragua. They think it may be 20 to 40% of Honduras's GDP destroyed in the course of a week by these storms. These are the kind of stories that almost tell themselves, the massive fires and so on. I think the key for journalists is to get past the point where they're talking about solutions in individual terms. What do I do with my diet? What kind of car should I drive? And help people understand that it's only when we're able to make big changes in political and economic structures that we have a chance of making change in the time that physics is allowing us. So I always say to, you know, journalists when they say, what's the most important thing an individual can do? I always say the most important thing an individual can do is be a little bit less of an individual, join together with others in movements large enough to make change. And happily, those movements are out there now.
I see. What I find quite interesting in your approach as well is that, just to quote, I mean, in last year in Time magazine, you wrote an article in a special issue that was called 2050, How the Earth Survived. Correct me if I misquoted, but I think that was the title of the issue.
Yes.
And you wrote this very interesting and prospective piece about what Earth could look like indeed in 2050 and like a possible scenario if we manage to follow the main agreements around the world to curb, in a way, to curb climate change. Are you now in 2020 hopeful that we can reach this scenario?
Well, I'm hopeful only if we go to work. I mean, look, the engineers have done their part of the job. They've dropped the cost of solar power and wind power 90% in the last decade. This is now the cheapest way to generate power around the earth. So if we wanted to, we could make huge progress fast. What gets in the way is inertia and the continuing power of the fossil fuel industry. Think about that East Africa crude oil pipeline that Total is trying to build. Just think about that as an example. Can anybody give a good reason why you would need yet more oil supply in 2020? If you build it, it's going to be there another 30, 40, 50 years. And if we keep doing things like that, then there's no chance of making real progress by 2050. So it's going to take a lot more courage than our political and corporate leadership have demonstrated so far. And it's the job of movements to keep pushing them in that direction.
And yeah, civil action as well. And what's also interesting is that, of course, you just had the results of the US elections a few days ago. How do you expect it to impact the global fight against climate change?
I think it'll make it a little easier. The US will be back in the Paris Climate Accords and back in the kind of international capacity. However, the elections didn't come out as well as we had hoped, and the Republicans retained control of the US Senate, which means that the prospect for big, effective legislative action in Washington is dramatically reduced. That's one of the reasons why I think that action taking on financial power is so important. The Biden administration will be able to make some real influence here with its appointments at the Treasury Department and elsewhere, and make it easier to put pressure on banks and oil companies, which I think is going to be key, because it's going to be very hard to make the kinds of big investments that we'd hoped would be possible. The Green New Deal will be very difficult to get through now in this environment.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. And more on a more personal note, what are your upcoming plans and projects or publications in regards to all the work that there's to do still? That would be my last question.
I'm actually very interested in working to organize older people now. I think that the youth climate movement has been extremely powerful, and I think it's time for people with hair that looks like mine to start organizing in some of those same effective ways. So that's what I'm going to be spending much of my time doing. Organizing
the older generation, if I may say, in continuing the fight.
There you are.
All right, that seems like a good plan. Well, thank you very much, Bill. Actually, I have a question from a journalist coming from France.
Okay.
Do you think the future of journalism is to become more involved in dealing with climate and social issues? If so, is journalistic neutrality compromised?
Well, I don't think that there's any question that climate change is the great story of our time. And I think one way to think of it really is as a lens through which to look at the world as much as a kind of issue on a list of issues. This is going to be the defining question for the 21st century. We spent the last 100 years looking at the world through a lens really of economic growth. And the question we basically were asking as a society about new ideas is, will this make us richer or not? And if the answer was yes, then we did it. And journalism was completely happy to go along with this approach. It just seemed as natural as the air we breathe. The question for the 21st century is going to be different. It's going to be, does whatever this action is add to or decrease our chances for survival? And that's a very different question, a very different lens through which to look through the world. And it will no doubt have influence how we think about these things as journalists. So just as no one's been neutral about the idea that, say, the stock market going up was a good thing, no one should be neutral about the idea that the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere going up is a bad thing.
All right. Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you for your time and for answering all our questions. I think that's all on our end. So I'll just switch back to French now and I will let you go, Bill. Thank you very much. And merci beaucoup à tous d'avoir assisté à cette session et à la prochaine.